The autumn wind of 1886 howled through the outskirts of Dodge City like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and something that made even the hardiest souls shutter their windows early. Silas Harrow rode his weathered stallion, Thunder, along the familiar trail that skirted the abandoned homesteads on the town's edge. At 43, Silas had seen enough of the world's cruelty to prefer the company of his horse and the endless Kansas sky to the crowded saloons and gossiping townsfolk. "Hi, how are you?" Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now. His weathered face, marked by years under the prairie sun, bore the kind of lines that spoke of hard decisions and harder losses. The silver star he once wore as a lawman now lay buried with his past, along with the family he'd failed to protect. These days, Silas Harrow was just another drifter, moving cattle for ranchers who paid in silver and asked no questions about a man's history. Thunder's ears pricked forward suddenly, and the horse's step faltered. Silas pulled gently on the reins, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt 45 at his hip. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came a sound that made his blood run cold. The desperate, broken sobbing of a child. "Easy, boy," Silas whispered to Thunder, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. The crying grew louder as he approached a cluster of dilapidated barns that had once belonged to the Morrison family before they'd packed up and fled town under mysterious circumstances 3 months prior. The sound led him to the largest barn, its doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. Silas drew his weapon and stepped into the musty darkness, his eyes adjusting to reveal a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days. In the center of the barn, a boy no older than 12 sat chained to a heavy wooden post, his small wrists raw and bleeding from the iron shackles that bound him. The child's clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears and grime. When he saw Silas, his eyes widened with a mixture of hope and terror that nearly brought the hardened cowboy to his knees. "Please, mister," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "Don't let them take me back. They said they'd hurt anyone who tries to help." Silas holstered his gun and knelt beside the child, examining the heavy chains with growing anger. These weren't makeshift restraints. They were professional shackles, the kind used by bounty hunters or worse. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy. Tommy Fletcher," the boy managed between ragged breaths. "My pa, he tried to stop them when they came for my sister. They shot him down like a dog in front of our house." "Your sister?" Silas's hands worked at the locks, his mind racing. "Where is she now?" Tommy's face crumpled with fresh tears. "They took her 3 days ago. Said she was special, that someone important wanted her real bad. When I tried to follow, they caught me too." The locks were beyond Silas's ability to pick, but he'd seen enough to know this was no ordinary kidnapping. The professional restraints, the calculated cruelty, the mention of someone important, this had the stench of organized crime, the kind that had been creeping into frontier towns as the railroad brought both progress and corruption. "Listen to me, Tommy," Silas said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "I'm going to get you out of here, but first I need to know, who took your sister? Did you see their faces?" The boy nodded frantically. "There were 5 of them. The leader, he had a scar right here." Tommy traced a line from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. "And he wore a ring with a snake on it. But mister, you don't understand. They said anyone who helps us will end up like the Morrisons." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. The Morrison family's sudden departure had been the talk of Dodge City for weeks, but no one had dared ask too many questions. Now he was beginning to understand why. "What happened to the Morrisons, Tommy?" "They found Mrs. Morrison's body in the river 2 weeks after they left," the boy whispered. "Sheriff Dalton said it was an accident, but everyone knows she was murdered because Mr. Morrison saw something he shouldn't have." The pieces were starting to form a picture that made Silas's stomach turn. A kidnapping ring operating with impunity, law enforcement either corrupted or intimidated into silence, and a town living in fear of speaking the truth. It was a scenario he'd seen before in his lawman days, but never on this scale. Thunder's nervous whinny from outside broke through his thoughts. Silas moved to the barn door and peered out, his blood turning to ice at what he saw. 3 riders approached in the distance, their silhouettes dark against the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "They're coming back." Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, but the terror in it was unmistakable. Silas made a decision that would change everything. Drawing his knife, he began working at the wooden post that held Tommy's chains. "I'm getting you out of here, son. But when we run, you stay close and you stay quiet. Can you do that?" Tommy nodded, tears of hope now mixing with those of fear. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, Silas worked frantically at the rotting wood, each second bringing their pursuers closer. The post finally gave way with a crack that seemed to echo through the barn like a gunshot. "Now!" Silas grabbed Tommy, chains and all, and they burst from the barn toward Thunder. The approaching riders shouted and spurred their horses forward, but Silas was already lifting the boy onto his saddle and swinging up behind him. As Thunder galloped toward the safety of town, Silas caught a glimpse of the lead rider, a man with a distinctive scar running from his ear to his mouth, just as Tommy had described. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the darkening prairie, and Silas saw something in that gaze that chilled him more than the autumn wind. The cold calculation of a predator who had just marked his next prey. The chase toward Dodge City had begun, but Silas Harrow had no idea that saving one boy would unleash a storm of violence that would shake the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about justice, corruption, and the price of doing what's right in a world where mercy was a luxury few could afford. The streets of Dodge City buzzed with an undercurrent of nervous energy as Silas rode Thunder through the main thoroughfare, Tommy still clutching the saddle horn with white knuckles. The boy's chains clinked softly with each step, drawing curious and fearful glances from the townsfolk who quickly averted their eyes when they recognized what they were seeing. Silas guided Thunder toward the blacksmith shop owned by Ezra Hutchins, a grizzled man in his 60s whose loyalty could be bought with honesty rather than coin. The rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil stopped abruptly as they approached, and Ezra emerged from his shop, wiping soot-stained hands on his leather apron. "Silas Harrow." Ezra's weathered face creased with concern as he took in the sight of the chained boy. "What in tarnation have you gotten yourself into?" "Nothing I couldn't handle, Ezra," Silas replied, dismounting and helping Tommy down. "But this boy needs those chains removed, and I need someone I can trust to do it quietly." Ezra's eyes darted nervously up and down the street before ushering them into his shop. "You know I'd help any child in need, Silas, but these aren't ordinary chains. I've seen ironwork like this before. It's the kind used by professional slave catchers down south. Whoever put these on this boy means business." As Ezra worked at the shackles with his tools, Tommy sat quietly, his young face bearing an expression far too mature for his years. Silas kept watch at the window, noting how the usual afternoon bustle of Dodge City seemed muted, as if the entire town was holding its breath. "There," Ezra said finally, as the last chain fell away with a satisfying clang. "But Silas, you need to know. Word's already spreading about what you did out there. Mrs. Henderson saw you riding in, and she's got a tongue that wags faster than a dog's tail." Tommy rubbed his raw wrists, wincing at the pain, but managing a grateful smile. "Thank you, mister. Both of you." "Don't thank us yet, son," Silas said grimly. "We still need to find your sister and figure out who's behind this." "Tommy, you mentioned they said someone important wanted her. Did they say anything else? Any names?" The boy's face darkened with concentration. "The scarred man. He kept talking about the colonel. Said the colonel had very specific tastes and paid well for girls like Sarah." Ezra's hammer slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. "Did you say the colonel?" Silas turned sharply. "You know that name?" "Every man in this town knows that name, even if they pretend they don't," Ezra said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Colonel Marcus Blackwood. Came to town about 6 months ago. Bought the old Pemberton mansion on the hill. Claims to be a retired cavalry officer, but... But? Silas pressed. But cavalry officers don't usually travel with a private army of gunmen, and they don't conduct their business meetings in the dead of night with men who look like they crawled out of the worst saloons in Kansas City. The pieces were beginning to form a clearer picture, and Silas didn't like what he was seeing. A corrupt official with military connections, operating with impunity in a town where the law seemed either bought or intimidated into silence. It was a scenario he'd encountered before, but never with children involved. "Where's Sheriff Dalton in all this?" Silas asked. Ezra's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Dalton's been mighty busy lately. Always seems to be out of town when anything unpleasant happens. Funny how his absences coincide with the colonel's activities." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Silas could see a crowd gathering around a man on horseback, the same scarred rider from the barn. The man was speaking loudly, his voice carrying across the street. "Citizens of Dodge City," the scarred man called out. "I am Marshal Wade Crenshaw, operating under federal authority. We are searching for a kidnapped boy and the man who unlawfully interfered with a federal investigation." Silas felt his blood run cold. Federal authority meant this operation had protection from higher up the chain than he'd imagined. Tommy pressed closer to him, trembling with fear. "That's him," the boy whispered. "That's the man who killed my pa." Marshal Crenshaw continued his announcement. "The man we seek is approximately 6 feet tall, dark hair, riding a black stallion. He is armed and extremely dangerous. Anyone providing information leading to his capture will be rewarded. Anyone harboring him will be considered an accomplice to federal crimes." The crowd began to murmur and disperse, but Silas noticed how many eyes turned toward the blacksmith shop. In a town this size, secrets were hard to keep, and his arrival with Tommy had been witnessed by too many people. "We need to move," Silas said urgently. "Ezra, is there somewhere safe we can—" The shop door burst open, and Martha Henderson, the town's most notorious gossip, rushed in with her eyes wide with excitement and fear. "Ezra, Silas, you need to know. That marshal is asking questions about you specifically, Silas. Someone told him you were seen with a boy matching the description of the one they're looking for." "Who told him?" Silas demanded. Martha's face flushed with embarrassment. I might have mentioned seeing you ride in. I didn't know it was important. But Silas, there's more. Doc Morrison is back in town, and he's been asking questions about his family. He says his wife didn't drown. She was murdered, and he has proof." The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. If Doc Morrison had evidence of his wife's murder, it could be the key to exposing the entire operation, but it also meant the doctor was in mortal danger. "Where is Doc Morrison now?" Silas asked. "He's staying at the hotel, but Silas, you can't go there. That marshal has men watching every building on Main Street." Tommy tugged at Silas's sleeve. "Mister, if Doc Morrison has proof about what happened to his wife, maybe he knows something about my sister, too. The Morrisons lived near us. Maybe he saw something the night Sarah was taken." Silas nodded grimly. The web of corruption and violence was becoming clearer, but so was the danger. Every move they made was being watched. Every ally they sought could be a trap. Yet somewhere in this maze of fear and deception, a young girl was being held captive, and time was running out. "Ezra," Silas said, making his decision, "I need you to get word to Doc Morrison. Tell him to meet us at the old church ruins outside town after midnight. And Martha—" "Yes?" the woman asked nervously. "You never saw us here tonight. Tommy Fletcher is just another runaway, and Silas Harrow rode through town and kept going. Can you do that?" Martha nodded quickly, understanding the gravity of the situation. As she hurried away, Silas turned to Tommy, seeing his own determination reflected in the boy's young eyes. "Are you ready for this, son? Because once we start down this path, there's no turning back." Tommy's voice was steady despite his fear. "My sister is counting on me, mister. I won't let her down." As darkness fell over Dodge City, Silas Harrow prepared for a confrontation that would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and the price of standing up to evil in a world where the law itself had been corrupted. The hunt for Sarah Fletcher was about to begin in earnest, but first they needed to survive the night. The ruins of the old Methodist church stood like broken teeth against the star-filled Kansas sky, its collapsed roof and crumbling walls bearing silent witness to a fire that had claimed the building 2 years prior. Silas and Tommy waited in the shadows of the remaining bell tower, their breath visible in the cold night air as they watched for any sign of Doc Morrison or unwanted company. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both tense. But relief flooded through Silas when he recognized the slight figure of Dr. Edmund Morrison dismounting from his horse. The doctor looked haggard, his usually neat appearance disheveled, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much. "Silas Harrow," Doc Morrison said quietly as he approached. "Ezra told me you needed to speak with me. I hope you understand the risk we're all taking by being here." "I understand more than you might think, Doc," Silas replied. "This is Tommy Fletcher. His sister was taken by the same people who killed your wife." Doc Morrison's face hardened at the mention of his wife. "Then you know we're dealing with monsters, but I have something that might help us stop them." He pulled a leather satchel from his coat. "Before I fled town, I managed to retrieve these from my wife's hiding place. She was documenting everything she witnessed." With trembling hands, Doc Morrison opened the satchel and withdrew a collection of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be a journal. Margaret was always curious, sometimes too curious for her own good. She started noticing strange activities around the Pemberton mansion shortly after Colonel Blackwood arrived. Tommy leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of activities?" "Wagons arriving in the dead of night, always with armed escorts. Young women and children being brought in but never seen leaving. Margaret started keeping a record, taking photographs when she could." Doc Morrison's voice broke slightly. "She was trying to gather enough evidence to contact the territorial authorities." Silas examined one of the photographs by moonlight. It showed a wagon approaching the mansion, with several figures visible in the back, figures that appeared to be bound. "How many people are we talking about, Doc?" "Based on Margaret's notes, at least 15 children and young women have disappeared in the past 6 months, all from families that couldn't afford to make a fuss, or from circumstances where their disappearance could be explained away. Like runaways or accidents," Silas said grimly, understanding the pattern. "Exactly. But Margaret discovered something else, something that got her killed." Doc Morrison pulled out a final document, his hands shaking. "She found out that Colonel Blackwood isn't working alone. He has connections in the territorial government, and there's a network of these operations across Kansas and Colorado." Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. "You mean there are other places like this?" "According to Margaret's research, yes. The Colonel is part of a larger organization that traffics in human misery. They target frontier towns where law enforcement is weak or corrupt, and they have enough political protection to operate with virtual impunity." Silas felt a cold rage building in his chest. This wasn't just about saving Tommy's sister anymore. It was about exposing a network of evil that was destroying innocent lives across the frontier. "Doc, do you know where they're keeping the children?" Margaret's last entry mentions a hidden cellar beneath the mansion, access through the old wine storage area. But Silas, you need to understand, the place is heavily guarded, and after what happened to Margaret, they'll be expecting trouble. A new voice cut through the night air, causing all three to freeze. "Well, well, Dr. Morrison, I had hoped you were smarter than this." Marshal Wade Crenshaw stepped from behind a collapsed wall, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. Behind him came 3 armed men, their weapons drawn and pointed at the small group. "You've led us quite a chase, Doctor," Crenshaw continued. "But your late wife's meddling ends here just like it ended for her." Doc Morrison's face contorted with rage. "You murdered her, you bastard!" "I did what was necessary to protect a legitimate business operation," Crenshaw replied coldly. "Just as I'm about to do now." Silas slowly moved his hand toward his gun, but stopped when one of Crenshaw's men shifted his aim directly at Tommy. The boy stood frozen with terror, but his eyes remained defiant. "Now, Mr. Harrow," Crenshaw said, "you're going to hand over those documents, and then you're all going to take a little ride with us. The colonel is very interested in meeting the man who's been causing so much trouble." "And if I refuse?" Silas asked, buying time while his mind raced for options. Then the boy dies first, followed by the good doctor, and then you. The choice is yours. It was Tommy who broke the tense silence. Mr. Harrow, don't give him those papers. My sister and all those other kids are counting on us. The boy's courage in the face of death reminded Silas why he'd worn a badge all those years ago. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. You know what, Marshal? Silas said, his voice steady. I think I'll take the third option. In one fluid motion, Silas dove toward Tommy while drawing his Colt, using the momentum to knock the boy behind the cover of a fallen beam. His first shot took down the gunman nearest to Doc Morrison, while his second sent another diving for cover. The night erupted in gunfire, muzzle flashes lighting up the ruins like deadly fireworks. Doc Morrison, showing surprising agility for a man his age, scrambled behind the altar stones with his precious documents, while Crenshaw and his remaining man sought cover behind the collapsed walls. You can't win this, Harrow, Crenshaw shouted over the gunfire. Even if you kill us all, there are more coming. The colonel has an army. Maybe, Silas called back, reloading quickly. But armies can be defeated when people know the truth. Tommy, showing remarkable courage for his age, had managed to retrieve a fallen gunman's weapon and was providing covering fire while Doc Morrison worked his way toward the horses. The boy's determination reminded Silas of himself at that age, before the world had taught him that heroes often died young and justice was a luxury most couldn't afford. A bullet splintered the wood near Silas's head, reminding him that this was no time for reflection. He returned fire, forcing Crenshaw to duck, then made his decision. Doc! Tommy! Get to the horses! I'll cover you! What about you? Tommy shouted. I'll be right behind you. Go! As Doc Morrison and Tommy made their desperate run for the horses, Silas provided covering fire, his shots keeping Crenshaw and his remaining man pinned down. But as he prepared to follow them, a searing pain tore through his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Through the haze of pain, he heard Crenshaw's triumphant laugh. End of the line, hero! But as the corrupt marshal stepped forward to finish him, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. Doc Morrison and Tommy had returned, and they weren't alone. Behind them rode a group of armed men, their faces grim with determination. Ezra? Silas gasped in surprise. Couldn't let you have all the fun, the blacksmith replied, leveling his shotgun at Crenshaw. Besides, this town's been living in fear long enough. The tide had turned, but Silas knew this was only the beginning. Colonel Blackwood still held Sarah Fletcher and countless other innocents, and the network of corruption ran deeper than any of them had imagined. As Doc Morrison helped bandage his wounded shoulder, Silas looked at the faces of the men who had chosen to stand with them, ordinary citizens who had decided that some things were worth fighting for. This isn't over, Crenshaw snarled as Ezra's men bound his hands. No, Silas agreed, struggling to his feet with Tommy's help. It's just beginning. Dawn was breaking over Dodge City as Silas, his left arm in a makeshift sling, studied the imposing silhouette of the Pemberton mansion through Doc Morrison's field glasses. The grand three-story structure sat atop a hill overlooking the town, its Gothic architecture and iron-barred windows giving it the appearance of a fortress rather than a home. Smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating the building was very much occupied. Beside him, Tommy Fletcher clutched a rifle that was almost as tall as he was, his young face set with determination that reminded Silas of soldiers he'd known who were twice the boy's age. Doc Morrison crouched nearby, organizing the medical supplies they'd gathered for what was sure to be a bloody confrontation. According to Margaret's notes, Doc Morrison said quietly, the main entrance is heavily guarded, but there's a service entrance on the north side that leads directly to the kitchen. From there, stairs lead down to the wine cellar, and that's where she believed the hidden entrance to the holding area was located. Ezra Hutchins, who had emerged as the unofficial leader of their small band of volunteers, nodded grimly. My boys have the front and south sides covered. If anyone tries to escape that way, they won't get far. Their army consisted of 12 men. Shopkeepers, ranchers, and laborers who had finally decided they'd had enough of living in fear. It wasn't much against what intelligence suggested was a force of 20 or more professional gunmen, but Silas had learned long ago that courage often mattered more than numbers. "Remember," Silas addressed the group, "our primary objective is to rescue the children and gather evidence. We're not here for revenge, no matter how much they might deserve it." Tommy looked up at him with eyes that held far too much pain for someone his age. "What about the colonel? What about making him pay for what he's done?" "Justice will come, son," Silas replied. "But first, we save your sister and the others." As they prepared to move out, the sound of approaching horses made everyone freeze. A lone rider was coming up the trail, Sheriff Dalton, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Silas felt his hand move instinctively to his gun, but the sheriff raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy, Silas," Dalton called out as he dismounted. "I'm not here to stop you." "Then why are you here?" Ezra demanded, his shotgun still trained on the lawman. Sheriff Dalton's weathered face showed a mixture of shame and determination. "Because I've been a coward for too long. The colonel's been paying me to look the other way, threatening my family if I didn't cooperate, but after what happened to Margaret Morrison and seeing that boy in chains," he gestured toward Tommy, "a man has to draw the line somewhere." "What do you know about the mansion's defenses?" Silas asked, deciding to trust the sheriff's apparent change of heart. "There are guards posted at every entrance, and the colonel has a private army of at least 15 men. But there's something else you need to know. They're planning to move the children tonight. A wagon train is supposed to arrive this afternoon to transport them to another location." Tommy's face went pale. "They're going to take Sarah away." "Not if we stop them first," Silas said firmly. He turned to the group. "This changes everything. We can't wait for nightfall. We move now." The assault began with Ezra's men creating a diversion at the front gate, their gunfire drawing the attention of the guards while Silas, Tommy, Doc Morrison, and Sheriff Dalton approached the service entrance. The kitchen door was unlocked, suggesting the colonel's arrogance had made him careless about security in areas he considered safe. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet except for the distant sound of shouting from the front of the building. Silas led the way through the kitchen and down a narrow staircase to the wine cellar, his Colt drawn and ready. The cellar was exactly as Margaret Morrison had described, rows of wine racks lining stone walls with a heavy wooden door at the far end that seemed out of place. "That has to be it," Doc Morrison whispered. The door was locked, but Sheriff Dalton produced a set of keys. "The colonel gave these to me for emergencies," he explained with disgust. "Never thought I'd be using them against him." Beyond the door lay a nightmare that would haunt Silas for the rest of his life. A narrow corridor led to a series of cells carved into the hillside, each containing children and young women in various states of despair. The smell of fear and unwashed bodies was overwhelming, but it was the sight of their faces, hopeful yet terrified, that nearly brought the hardened cowboy to his knees. "Sarah!" Tommy's cry echoed through the corridor as he spotted his sister in the third cell. The girl, no more than 14, looked up with eyes that had seen too much, but her face lit up with joy and disbelief when she saw her brother. "Tommy, how did you—" Sarah's words were cut off as Silas shot the lock off her cell door. "We're getting you out of here," Silas said gently, helping the girl to her feet. "All of you." As they worked to free the other prisoners, 7 children and 3 young women, all showing signs of mistreatment but alive, the sound of gunfire from above grew more intense. Time was running out. "There's another way out," one of the older girls said. "Through the tunnel behind the last cell. The colonel uses it to move people without being seen." Sheriff Dalton nodded. "It leads to the old mine shaft about half a mile from here. We can get them out safely that way." But as they prepared to evacuate the prisoners, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Colonel Marcus Blackwood appeared, flanked by 3 armed men, his military bearing and cold eyes radiating menace. "Gentlemen," the colonel said in a cultured voice that made his words even more chilling, "I'm afraid you've made a serious mistake." Blackwood was everything Silas had expected. Tall, distinguished, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command and the eyes of someone who viewed other human beings as commodities. His uniform was immaculate, his gray hair perfectly groomed, and his smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Colonel Marcus Blackwood," Silas said, his gun trained on the man's chest. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, murder, and human trafficking." The colonel's laugh was genuinely amused. "Arrest? My dear fellow, you seem to be confused about who has authority here. I have connections that reach all the way to Washington. This operation has the tacit approval of people whose names you wouldn't recognize, but whose power you couldn't comprehend." "Maybe," Silas replied, "but they're not here right now, and you are." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the shooting started, it was Tommy who fired first, his bullet taking down one of the colonel's men. The confined space erupted in gunfire, with Doc Morrison and Sheriff Dalton diving to protect the freed prisoners, while Silas and the colonel faced each other in a deadly dance. When the smoke cleared, Colonel Blackwood lay dead, his dreams of empire ended by a lonely cowboy who had simply decided that some things were worth fighting for. His remaining men, seeing their leader fallen and hearing the sounds of Ezra's successful assault from above, threw down their weapons in surrender. As they led the freed prisoners to safety through the tunnel, Tommy walked beside his sister, their hands clasped tightly together. Sarah was weak and traumatized, but alive, and the love between the siblings was evident in every glance they shared. "What happens now?" Tommy asked as they emerged into the sunlight. Silas looked back at the mansion, where smoke was beginning to rise from several windows, as Ezra's men ensured that this place of horror would never again serve its evil purpose. In his pocket, he carried Margaret Morrison's documents, evidence that would expose the entire network and bring justice to other towns suffering under similar operations. "Now we rebuild," Silas said simply. "We make sure this never happens again, and we help people like your sister heal from what they've endured." Sheriff Dalton, who had proven his redemption through his actions, nodded grimly. "The territorial authorities will need to hear about this. There are other operations out there, other children who need saving." As they walked toward town, where the people of Dodge City were gathering to celebrate their liberation from fear, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The chains that had bound this community in terror had been broken, not by a lone hero, but by ordinary people who had found the courage to stand together against evil. Tommy Fletcher looked up at him with eyes that, while still bearing the scars of what he'd witnessed, now held the light of possibility. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow, for everything." Silas smiled, feeling the weight of his past finally beginning to lift. "Thank you, son. You reminded me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself." As the sun set over Dodge City, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the town began the long process of healing. The nightmare was over, but more importantly, the people had learned that they had the power to ensure it would never return. In a land where mercy was scarce and trust was a luxury, they had discovered that courage, when shared, could overcome even the darkest evil. The lonely cowboy had found his purpose again, and Dodge City would never be the same. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.